August 17th, 2023, Northern Ontario. Two wildlife biologists tracking caribou through dense boreal forest stumbled upon something that didn't belong in their data, or in any nightmare they could have imagined. Half buried among lichen-covered rocks sat an abandoned prospector's shelter, its roof sagging under decades of neglect. Inside, leaning against the far wall in the dim light filtering through a single cracked window, were two figures seated side by side, their hands touched. Their bodies were mummified, held together by the dry air and time itself. But it was their faces that stopped the biologists cold. Both were completely wrapped in strips of fabric, carefully, deliberately, as if someone had taken great care to cover what remained. Between them sat a red thermos, still sealed. What investigators eventually found inside that thermos would turn a 4-year-old missing persons case into something that defied every theory they'd constructed. Because Douglas and Vivian Kincaid had been missing for exactly 1,460 days. And the position of their bodies, the state of the shelter, and the items arranged around them suggested one impossible truth. They hadn't died alone. Or perhaps worse, they had died knowing they were being watched. Before we uncover what really happened in that shelter, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're drawn to mysteries that blur the line between tragedy and something darker, hit that subscribe button. You're about to hear a story that still has no official ending. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Douglas Kincaid turned 64 in the summer of 2019. His wife, Vivian, would celebrate her 62nd birthday that August. They had been married for 38 years, a marriage that friends described as one of those rare partnerships where two people genuinely completed each other's sentences. Not in the cliché way people joke about, but in the quiet way of couples who've shared so much life that words become optional. Doug was a retired forestry technician from Thunder Bay, Ontario. He'd spent 3 decades walking through forests, measuring timber, identifying disease patterns in tree populations, and training younger technicians to read the wilderness the way most people read street signs. He knew the boreal forest of Northern Ontario the way a sailor knows the sea, intimately, respectfully, and with the understanding that familiarity never equals control. Vivian had been a nurse for 35 years before retiring. She'd worked pediatrics, then hospice care, finally settling into a quiet position at a long-term care facility where she was known for her calm presence and her ability to comfort families facing impossible decisions. But outside of work, her passion was botany. She kept detailed journals of every camping trip, pressing wildflowers between pages, sketching the shapes of leaves, noting where rare orchids bloomed. They weren't thrill seekers. They didn't chase adrenaline or test their limits. They were methodical, careful, the kind of people who researched, prepared, and respected the wilderness as something beautiful but indifferent. For over 20 years, they'd taken annual September camping trips to Wabakimi Provincial Park, one of Ontario's most remote wilderness areas. It was their ritual, a way to close out summer and greet autumn in the place where they felt most at peace. Park rangers knew them by name. They always filed proper trip plans, always returned when they said they would, always waved as they paddled past the ranger station with their gear packed precisely and their route maps laminated against the weather. Their adult children, Trevor, 35, who worked in tech in Toronto, and Colleen, 32, a social worker in Winnipeg, had grown up hearing stories about Wabakimi. About the glassy lakes at dawn, the loons calling across the water, the way the northern lights danced green and violet over the tree line in early autumn. Both kids described their parents the same way, inseparable, intensely private, deeply content with each other. In preparation for their 2019 trip, Doug and Vivian upgraded their equipment. They bought a new GPS device, Doug's concession to modern safety, and a satellite phone, though he joked to Trevor that it was only for emergencies, not for checking sports scores in the wilderness. They purchased a new tent, lighter than their old one, but rated for early fall temperatures. Vivian bought a pink sleeping bag, brighter than her usual earth tones. So it doesn't get lost in the sand, she'd told her mother with a laugh. Vivian had traditions. She pressed wildflowers in her journal every trip, labeling them with dates and GPS coordinates. Doug had his own rituals. He left small cairns, stacks of flat stones, at viewpoints they discovered, marking places of beauty the way others might bookmark pages in a book. On September 1, 2019, Vivian posted a photo on Facebook. It showed their gear laid out on their living room floor. Tent, packs, cooking equipment, the bright pink sleeping bag. The caption read, "One more time into the quiet." Friends later admitted the phrasing struck them as odd, not alarming, just slightly melancholic for a couple who usually radiated excitement before their trips. One more time into the quiet, as if they knew something was ending. But at the time, no one thought anything of it. On September 3, 2019, Douglas and Vivian Kincaid loaded their silver Ford F-150, locked their house, and drove north toward the wilderness that had given them peace for 2 decades. They would never come home. September 3rd was a Tuesday. The drive from Thunder Bay to Wabakimi Provincial Park's access point takes roughly 4 hours along Highway 527, a route that transitions from paved roads to gravel, from small towns to absolute wilderness. Security footage from the last gas station, a place called Desjardins Fuel Stop, about 40 kilometers from the park entrance, captured them at 11:47 a.m. The footage is grainy, but clear enough. Vivian is wearing a blue fleece jacket and a wide-brimmed sun hat. Doug is in his usual flannel shirt, faded jeans, hiking boots that look older than some of the trees they'd walk among. They fill the truck, buy bottled water, energy bars, and a local newspaper. The attendant, a young woman named Margot, later told police she remembered them because they seemed happy, relaxed, like people heading somewhere they loved. They entered Wabakimi Provincial Park just after 1 p.m. They filed their trip plan with the ranger station, an 8-day canoe route through a familiar section of the park, a loop that would take them through interconnected lakes, portages they'd walked a dozen times, campsites they knew by heart. Expected return, September 11, Wednesday, by 5 p.m. The park ranger who logged their entry, a man named Bruce Talbot, remembered them well. They were regulars, he later told investigators. Doug showed me his new GPS, joked about finally joining the 21st century. Vivian asked about water levels and whether the orchids would still be blooming. Normal stuff. They seemed great. Their route was a variation they'd done before. Nothing extreme. No dangerous rapids, no technical climbing. Just wilderness, water, and the kind of solitude most people never experience. On September 5, 2 days into their trip, Doug made a satellite phone call to Trevor. It was brief. Doug didn't like using the phone in the bush, said it broke the spell of being disconnected. The call lasted 4 minutes. Trevor later recounted the conversation to police, straining to remember details that had seemed mundane at the time. Dad said the weather was holding. Sunny, cool nights, perfect conditions. He said Mom had found some rare orchids and was losing her mind with excitement. His words. He sounded good, happy. But there was one detail, one small thing that Trevor didn't think about until much later. He mentioned seeing more old prospector camps than usual. Some of them looked recently disturbed, like maybe squatters or hunters were using them. He didn't sound worried, just observant, like he was noting it. Trevor asked if everything was okay. Doug laughed. "Your mother and I have been doing this for 20 years. We're fine. See you Wednesday." That was the last time anyone heard Douglas Kincaid's voice. September 6 through 11 passed without further contact. This wasn't unusual. The Kincaids valued disconnection. They'd often gone the entire week without calling, emerging from the wilderness refreshed and full of stories about what they'd seen. But on September 11, when 5 p.m. came and went with no sign of the silver F-150 pulling up to the ranger station, Bruce Talbot noted it in his log. By 7 p.m., he tried calling the satellite phone. No answer. By 9 p.m., he contacted the Ontario Provincial Police. September 12, the search began as routine. Rangers drove to the parking area where the Kincaids had left their truck. It was there, locked, undisturbed. A layer of dust and pine needles covered the hood. It had been sitting for over a week. Inside, everything was as it should be. Their wallets with cash and credit cards, spare clothing, a cooler with melted ice. Nothing taken, nothing disturbed. By noon, a search team had launched canoes and followed the Kincaids' planned route. 15 kilometers in, they found the couple's canoe pulled up onto shore at a campsite marked on their trip plan. The canoe was properly secured, tied to a tree, paddles stowed underneath. The campsite showed clear signs of use: a cold fire pit with charred wood, tent impressions in the ground, 4 rectangular depressions where the corners had been staked, flattened grass where their packs had sat. But the tent itself was gone. The packs were gone. The sleeping bags, the cooking equipment, gone. The first mystery emerged. Experienced campers don't pack up a perfectly good campsite and move deeper into the wilderness without a reason. Especially not when that campsite was on their planned route, in a location they'd used before, with access to water and easy portaging. Something had made them leave. By September 15, the operation had expanded. Ontario Provincial Police coordinated with volunteer search teams, park rangers, and canine units. The search area covered 200 square kilometers of dense boreal forest, black spruce, jack pine, thick underbrush, rocky outcroppings, swamps that could swallow a person in seconds. The lead investigator was Sergeant Helena Prules, a 20-year veteran of wilderness search operations. She'd seen people get lost, seen accidents, seen the aftermath of poor decisions. But this case immediately struck her as different. "The campsite bothered me," she later wrote in her report. "It wasn't abandoned in panic. The fire was properly extinguished. The canoe was secured correctly. These weren't people who fled in terror. They made a deliberate choice to pack everything and go." Search dogs picked up a scent trail leading northeast, away from the Kincaids' planned route, away from the lakes, into rough terrain with no established trails. The dogs followed the scent for nearly 2 kilometers before losing it at a rocky creek bed where water would have washed away any trace. A helicopter equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the search area for 3 days straight. They found nothing. No heat signatures, no signs of camp, no bright pink sleeping bag visible from the air. The weather began to turn. Early autumn storms rolled in, cold rain and wind that made search operations dangerous and erased any remaining ground evidence. On September 18, a hiker contacted park authorities with a curious observation. 3 days after the Kincaids' last confirmed contact, September 8, he'd been camping in an area well off the standard routes. Around dusk, he'd seen a very thin column of smoke rising from the forest to the northeast, in a direction where no marked campsites existed. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Campers sometimes went off route. But when he heard about the missing couple, he wondered if it might have been them. Search teams combed the area he'd indicated. They found no fire pit, no charred wood, no evidence anyone had been there. The terrain was difficult, rocky, steep, covered in deadfall that made walking treacherous. Another witness came forward. A young couple who'd been camping in the park during the same time frame mentioned seeing an older couple on September 7 hiking along a portage trail heading west. They hadn't spoken to them, just passed with the usual nod that campers exchange. The description was vague: older, backpacks, moving slowly. But the direction was wrong. West would have taken the Kincaids away from their route toward even more remote areas. The identity was never confirmed. The young couple couldn't say for certain it was the Kincaids, just 2 people who fit a general description. By September 23, Sergeant Prules called a meeting with the Kincaid family. Trevor and Colleen had been staying in Thunder Bay, spending their days at the search headquarters, staring at maps, hoping. Prules was direct but compassionate. "We've covered everything within the probable survival radius. We found no evidence of foul play, no signs of accident or injury, but the circumstances are unusual, very unusual." She explained the puzzle: experienced campers, proper equipment, good weather, familiar territory. Yet they'd abandoned their planned route, packed up a good campsite, and traveled cross-country through terrain that offered no advantages. No better camping, no shorter path, nothing. "Something made them change their plans," Prules said. "Until we understand what, we're searching blind." The active search was scaled back to periodic helicopter sweeps and ranger patrols. The case remained open. But as September turned to October and October turned to November, hope began to hollow out. By December 2019, Douglas and Vivian Kincaid were officially classified as missing, presumed lost in wilderness. For their family, it was the beginning of not knowing. In the months following the disappearance, investigators worked through every scenario, every theory, trying to find one that fit all the facts. Each seemed plausible until a small detail, a piece of evidence, a logical inconsistency pulled it apart. Vivian had type 2 diabetes, well controlled with medication and diet. Could she have had a crisis, a sudden drop in blood sugar, confusion, disorientation? The theory went, Vivian becomes ill. Doug panics, tries to get her to help. In his urgency, he misjudges the route, gets them lost. They succumb to exposure before he can correct course. But the satellite phone undermined this. It had battery life. It was designed for exactly this scenario. If Vivian was in medical distress, Doug would have used it immediately. He wasn't reckless. He was a man who'd spent 30 years in the forest professionally. And the GPS device, also missing, why not use it if you're lost? The theory didn't hold. Bear activity that season was normal for Wabakimi, black bears mostly, and they typically avoid humans. Could the Kincaids have had a close encounter that scared them into leaving their campsite? Experienced campers know how to handle bears, make noise, back away slowly, don't run. Doug had encountered bears dozens of times in his career. He knew the protocols. Even if a bear had gotten into their food supply, the correct response would be to call for ranger assistance, not to pack everything and travel for days deeper into the wilderness without signaling for help. The theory fell apart under scrutiny. Police quietly investigated this possibility, standard procedure in missing persons cases. Financial troubles, marital issues, secret life insurance policies? They found nothing. Bank accounts were modest but stable. No unusual transactions before the trip. Their marriage, by every account, was solid. No affairs, no hidden debts, no motives. Trevor and Colleen were adamant. They had grandchildren they adored, Colleen told investigators, her voice breaking. They had plans for Christmas. Dad was building a playhouse for my daughter. They'd never just leave. The theory had no foundation. Could they have encountered someone in the wilderness? A hunter? Someone living off-grid illegally? A chance meeting that turned violent? Wabakimi is vast, over 8,000 square kilometers of protected wilderness. It's remote enough that illegal hunters, squatters, or people fleeing society occasionally use it as a hideout. But there were no signs of struggle at their campsite. No blood, no scattered equipment, no evidence of confrontation. And if they'd been attacked, why would they have had time to pack their tent and supplies? The theory raised more questions than it answered. In her final report before the case went cold, Sergeant Prulux wrote a paragraph that would later prove prescient. The couple made a deliberate decision to leave their planned route. They packed their entire camp and traveled on foot into terrain with no trails, no marked campsites, and no strategic advantage. This suggests purpose, not panic. They were moving towards something or away from something. But what? Trevor took a leave of absence from his job and spent 6 weeks in Thunder Bay, conducting his own searches on weekends when weather permitted. He walked trails, talked to locals, posted flyers with his parents' photos in every small town within 100 kilometers. Colleen created a social media campaign, #FindTheKincaids. It gained traction briefly, shared by outdoor enthusiast groups and missing persons advocates. Tips came in, dozens of them. Someone thought they'd seen an older couple at a gas station in Minnesota. Another swore they'd spotted the silver F-150 near Kenora. Every lead was checked. Every lead went nowhere. By December 2019, Trevor and Colleen had to return to their lives, their jobs, their own families. But Thunder Bay stayed with them. The not knowing. Vivian's sister hired a private investigator in 2021. He spent 3 months reviewing the case files, interviewing witnesses, even hiring a plane to fly over remote sections of the park. He found nothing new. His final report concluded, "Without physical evidence or witnesses, this case cannot be advanced further." The Kincaid family held annual memorial paddles at Wabakimi Park, launching canoes from the same spot Doug and Vivian had started their final trip. Friends and former colleagues attended, sharing stories, keeping their memory alive. Doug's brother told a reporter in 2022, "Doug knew that land better than anyone. Something happened that forced their hand. That's the only explanation that makes sense. Something made them choose the harder path." Park rangers kept the case on their radar. New hires were briefed. Photos of the Kincaids stayed pinned to the bulletin board in the ranger station. If their bodies were found, if any evidence surfaced, someone would recognize it. But the wilderness is vast and patient. It holds on to secrets the way permafrost holds on to seeds, locked away, silent, waiting. For 4 years, that's where the story rested. Until August 17, 2023, when 2 biologists tracking caribou found a shelter that shouldn't have been there. Dr. Felix Rousseau and Nadia Owell were 3 days into a 2-week field study, tracking a herd of woodland caribou for Ontario's Ministry of Natural Resources. The caribou, fitted with GPS collars, were part of a conservation effort to monitor their declining population across the boreal forest. On the morning of August 17, one of the GPS signals led them to an area 47 kilometers northeast of where the Kincaids had last been confirmed, well outside the original search radius. The terrain was brutal, rocky, steep, covered in dense underbrush and deadfall. The kind of place that requires serious effort to reach, the kind of place that offers no reward for the struggle except more of the same. Felix later described it as the middle of nowhere's middle of nowhere. They were following a caribou signal that had been stationary for 36 hours, usually an indicator that the animal had died. As they climbed a rocky rise, breathing hard in the humid August air, Nadia spotted something through the trees, a structure. Low, partially buried, covered in moss and lichen. It looked like a natural rock formation at first glance, but the angles were too straight, the stones too deliberately placed. "Old prospector's cabin," Felix said. "Probably 1930s, maybe earlier." They approached carefully. The structure was maybe 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, built into the hillside with stacked stones and weathered logs. The roof, what remained of it, was partially collapsed, but parts of the interior were still protected from the elements. A single small window, no glass, just an opening. The doorway was low, maybe 4 feet high, designed for a time when people were smaller or when conserving heat mattered more than comfort. Felix crouched and peered inside. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dimness. Then he saw them. 2 figures seated against the back wall, side by side, their backs straight against the stone. At first, Felix's brain couldn't process what he was seeing. His first thought, oddly, was that they looked patient, like people waiting for a bus that was very, very late. But they weren't people anymore. They were remains, preserved by the dry air and the shelter's protection from scavengers. Mummified. Skin like leather, pulled tight over bones. Their clothes were faded but intact. Flannel, fleece, the muted colors of outdoor gear. Their hands appeared to be touching, not clasped, but resting near each other, fingers almost intertwined. And their faces were completely wrapped in strips of fabric, carefully, methodically, as if someone had taken great care to cover every inch. The fabric was the same faded color as their clothing, torn from their own shirts and jackets. Between them sat a red thermos. Felix backed out of the shelter so quickly he hit his head on the low doorway. "Nadia," he said, his voice strange in his own ears. "Call the OPP, right now." While Nadia made the satellite phone call, Felix stood outside the shelter, breathing hard. He'd seen dead animals countless times in his career, caribou, moose, bears in various states of decay. This was different. "This was staged," he later told investigators. "That was my first thought. The way they were positioned, the wrapped faces, the thermos between them like some kind of offering. It felt deliberate. But staged by who? Them? Someone else?" The nearest OPP detachment was over 200 kilometers away. Getting personnel and equipment to this location would require helicopter transport. The dispatcher told Nadia not to touch anything, not to enter the structure again, and to mark their GPS coordinates precisely. They waited 4 hours. Felix and Nadia sat on rocks 50 meters from the shelter, not speaking much, occasionally glancing back at the low doorway. The forest around them buzzed with insects. A raven landed on the collapsed roof, cawed twice, and flew away. The OPP helicopter landed in a clearing 400 meters away, the only flat space large enough. 6 people hiked to the site. 2 OPP officers, a forensic identification specialist, a coroner, and, at her own insistence, Sergeant Helena Pruill, now retired but called back as a consultant the moment the missing couple was mentioned. When Pruill saw the shelter, she stopped walking. She stood completely still for nearly a minute, staring at the entrance. One of the younger officers asked if she was okay. "I've been searching for them for 4 years," she said quietly. "I walked every kilometer of the original search area, and they were here, outside the radius, all this time." The forensic team, led by Dr. Yves Beaumont, photographed everything before entering. Exterior shots from every angle, the surrounding terrain, the sight lines to and from the shelter, the condition of the roof, the walls, the window. Then Dr. Beaumont crouched and entered. Inside, he worked slowly, methodically. Every item was photographed in place before being tagged and documented. The bodies were positioned too deliberately, seated upright, not slumped, backs against the wall, legs extended, hands positioned carefully. The wrapped faces were the most disturbing element. The fabric showed no signs of having been tied or knotted. It was simply wrapped, layer upon layer, covering from the forehead to below the chin. It would have taken time, care, deliberate action. The red thermos sat precisely between them, its metal surface dulled by time but structurally intact. It was sealed. Dr. Beaumont didn't open it at the scene. It would be processed at the lab. 2 backpacks leaned against the wall, positioned as if their owners had just set them down. The fabric was faded and dust-covered, but intact. A tent was rolled neatly in the corner, tied with cord. Sleeping bags, one of them bright pink, color preserved in the dry shelter, were folded nearby. There were no signs of violence, no blood spatter, no bullet holes, no knife marks on the wooden surfaces, no scattered belongings suggesting a struggle. But there was something else, an absence that spoke louder than presence. No food wrappers scattered around, no empty water bottles discarded carelessly. Everything was arranged, organized, as if someone had prepared for a long stay, or prepared to die. Dental records were pulled from the Kincaid family dentist in Thunder Bay. Comparison was made within 72 hours. Confirmation: the remains belonged to Douglas Kincaid, age 64, and Vivian Kincaid, age 62. Sergeant Prowse made the call to Trevor herself. She'd promised him, back in 2019, that if his parents were ever found, he'd hear it from her first. Trevor answered on the second ring. "Sergeant Prowse? Trevor, we found them." There was a long silence. Then, very quietly, "Are they?" "Yes, I'm so sorry." Another silence. Then Trevor's voice, thick with tears. "Where?" When she told him, 47 kilometers from their last confirmed location, outside the search radius, in terrain that shouldn't have been possible for them to reach, Trevor made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. 4 years, he said. They were out there for 4 years, and we walked right past them. "We came within 5 kilometers, Prowse admitted. "The shelter was naturally camouflaged. We never would have found it without the biologists." By August 20, the story had broken nationally. Missing Canadian couple found dead after 4 years in remote shelter ran in every major newspaper. The Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, CBC all picked it up. The covered faces became the focal point. Speculation ran wild. Was it a ritual? A murder staged to look like something else? A suicide pact? The family released a brief statement asking for privacy and respect as they processed the news, but the public fascination didn't dim. True crime podcasts began covering the case. Online forums dissected every detail. But the real investigation was just beginning. Because when Dr. Beaumont performed the full forensic examination, he discovered something that changed everything. Dr. Yves Beaumont had been a forensic pathologist for 22 years. He'd examined bodies recovered from car accidents, house fires, industrial disasters, and wilderness exposure. He prided himself on clinical detachment, on seeing remains as puzzles to solve rather than people who'd once lived. But the Kincaid case stayed with him, not because of what he found, but because of what he didn't find. Both bodies were in a remarkable state of preservation. The shelter's dry environment and protection from scavengers had mummified the remains. Soft tissue was desiccated but present. Internal organs were deteriorated but not entirely gone. The bones told most of the story. Douglas Kincaid showed signs of extreme dehydration, shrinkage of soft tissues, concentration of minerals in bone marrow. His joints showed no traumatic injuries, no broken bones, no fractures. His teeth were intact. His skull showed no signs of impact. Vivian Kincaid's skeleton revealed similar findings: extreme dehydration, starvation. But there was one detail. Her left ankle showed a healed fracture from years prior, and her right ankle showed signs of soft tissue swelling that had occurred perimortem, around the time of death. The swelling suggested a sprain or minor fracture that had never received medical treatment. Neither body showed any signs of violence: no gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no blunt force trauma. The cause of death for both, exposure and dehydration, possibly accelerated by hypothermia during cold nights. But here's what haunted Dr. Beaumont. Stomach contents showed they had eaten small amounts of food over several days. Partially digested energy bars, dried fruit. This meant they hadn't died immediately upon reaching the shelter. They had survived there, consuming their supplies slowly for approximately 4 to 7 days. They were conscious for most of that time, Dr. Beaumont later testified. They ate, they moved, they were aware of what was happening to them. The question became, why didn't they leave? Why didn't they call for help? The strips of fabric covering their faces were sent to a forensics lab for analysis. The findings were straightforward but chilling. The fabric was torn from their own clothing. Fibers matched Doug's flannel shirt and Vivian's fleece jacket. The tears were clean, methodical, not the frantic ripping of panic, but careful tearing, as if someone had taken their time. The placement of the fabric over their faces was determined to be post-mortem based on one key finding: no compression marks on the underlying bone structure. If the fabric had been wrapped while they were alive and left in place for days, the pressure would have left subtle marks. There were none. But the hands, the way the hands were positioned, suggested something else. Both Doug and Vivian's hands were placed near their faces, fingers in positions consistent with holding or adjusting fabric. The forensic conclusion was carefully worded. It is possible one individual wrapped the other's face after death, then wrapped their own face while still conscious but in the final stages of dying. This meant someone had been alive long enough after the first death to perform this act, and then they had covered their own face, knowing what was coming. The red thermos was opened in a controlled laboratory environment. Inside, approximately 500 milliliters of liquid, now partially evaporated but still present. Chemical analysis revealed water mixed with crushed pine needles, a common wilderness technique for making a mildly aromatic tea, and trace amounts of benzodiazepine. The medication was identified as lorazepam, an anti-anxiety medication. Cross-reference with Vivian's medical records confirmed she had a valid prescription for lorazepam used to manage occasional anxiety and insomnia. The concentration in the thermos wasn't lethal. It would have induced drowsiness, calm, a gentle sedation. Mixed with the water and pine needles, it would have tasted slightly bitter but not unpleasant. But here's the mystery. The thermos had not been drunk from. It was completely full. The seal was intact. Why prepare it and not drink it? Dr. Beaumont's theory: they may have prepared it as a final comfort, intending to drink it in their last moments. But something stopped them.
Fear, perhaps, or hope, or the simple human instinct to stay conscious, even when unconsciousness would be mercy. The contents of the backpacks were inventoried carefully. Remaining food, 6 energy bars, a small bag of dried cranberries, a sealed package of jerky.
Enough for perhaps 2 or 3 more days if rationed carefully. Water filter, unused, still in its case. This was significant. The filter would have allowed them to purify water from nearby sources. Why didn't they use it? Clothing layers, extra socks, thermal underwear, a wool swatter. Nothing out of the ordinary. First aid kit, largely intact, but several bandages had been used, likely for Vivian's ankle injury. The tent had never been pitched at the shelter. It was rolled and tied, dry inside, showing no signs of recent use. This suggested they'd arrived at the shelter and decided, or were forced, to stay inside rather than setting up camp outside. The satellite phone was found in Doug's pack. The battery was completely dead, but when forensic technicians connected it to power and examined its system logs, they found something crucial. The phone had been powered on multiple times between September 6th and September 9. Each time it had searched for signal. Each time it had failed to connect. The last attempted power on was September 9 at 3:47 p.m. After that, the battery had died completely. The GPS device told a similar story. Its last recorded waypoint was September 8, 2019 at 2:13 p.m. Location, approximately 12 kilometers south of the shelter. This meant the Kincaids had traveled 12 kilometers over extremely difficult terrain between their last GPS ping and their arrival at the shelter. 12 kilometers through forest, over rocks, around swamps. With Vivian's ankle injured. With their devices dying. The journal was found in Vivian's pack, sealed in a waterproof case. It was a leather-bound notebook worn from years of use. Previous entries detailed past trips, filled with sketches of plants, observations about wildlife, cheerful notes about weather and Doug's terrible camp coffee. The last entry was September 8, 2019. The handwriting was shaky, each word taking visible effort. Doug insists we keep moving, says we can't go back now. I don't understand his urgency, but I trust him. My ankle is worse. We found an old shelter on the map, heading there. If anyone finds this. The entry ended mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted, or as if finishing the thought was too painful. Earlier entries from the trip were normal. September 3. Perfect weather. Portage was easier than last year. Doug thinks the water levels are lower. September 5. Found a patch of pink lady slippers. Drew them before the light faded. September 6. Loons calling across the lake at sunset. This never gets old. But September 7's entry had a different tone. Doug spotted someone else's campsite today, maybe half a kilometer from ours. Looked abandoned, but recent. Fresh fire pit, trash that hasn't weathered yet. Strange to see anyone this far out. Doug seemed bothered by it. He's been quieter tonight. Doug's topographic map was found in his pack, creased and worn but clearly marked. It showed Wabakimi Park in detail with handwritten annotations. 3 locations were circled. Their original campsite, where the canoe was found, a location approximately 8 kilometers northeast, marked with an X, the shelter location circled with an arrow pointing to it. Next to the X was a faint pencil note in Doug's handwriting, "Not safe." This suggested a sequence. They'd left their campsite, traveled northeast, encountered something at the X location that Doug deemed unsafe, and continued onward to the shelter. The shelter had been circled deliberately, as if it were a destination. Doug must have known it was there, possibly from his years as a forestry technician, possibly from old maps he'd studied. He'd chosen it as a refuge, but from what? The official forensic report concluded, both individuals died of exposure and dehydration after spending several days in the shelter. Physical evidence suggests they were conscious and able to move for most of this period, yet made no attempt to leave the shelter or signal for help. The positioning of the bodies and the preparation of the sedative mixture suggests anticipation of death and possible mutual decision-making. However, the reason for their failure to use available survival tools or call for rescue remains unexplained. In a private conversation with Sergeant Prules, Dr. Beaumont was more direct. They were afraid, he said. Everything about that scene suggests fear. They locked themselves in that shelter and waited. For rescue, maybe? Or for whatever they were hiding from to go away. And it didn't, Prules said. No, it didn't. With the forensic results in hand, the case was officially reclassified. No longer a missing persons case. Now it was a criminal investigation, unlawful confinement causing death. The Ontario Provincial Police Major Crimes Unit assigned Detective Inspector Pascal Morin to lead. He was a methodical investigator, known for his ability to see patterns others missed. His first action was to return to the beginning, September 2023. 4 years after the Kincaids had disappeared, a team returned to the location where their canoe had been found. Nature had reclaimed most of it. The fire pit was buried under leaves and soil. The flattened grass had long since regrown. But Detective Morin ordered a thorough excavation of the fire pit. Shovel by shovel, they removed years of sediment. At the bottom, buried under decomposed organic matter, they found something the original search had missed: partially burned paper. The fragments were sent to a forensics lab specializing in document recovery. Using chemical analysis and high-resolution imaging, they determined the paper stock matched Vivian's journal exactly. Someone had torn pages out of her journal and burned them in that fire pit. The pages were too damaged to recover any writing, but their existence raised a crucial question: who had burned them? Had Doug destroyed pages describing something he didn't want found? Or had someone else come to the campsite after they left and burned evidence? The team traveled to the spot on Doug's map marked "Not Safe." It was a natural clearing near a creek, objectively a good campsite. Level ground, access to water, sheltered by trees. But as they swept the area with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, they found something. A shotgun shell casing, 12-gauge, red plastic with a brass base. It was lying under a thin layer of pine needles and decomposed leaves, but it hadn't been there long enough to corrode significantly. A forensic analysis of weathering patterns suggested it had been fired in late summer or early autumn 2019. The Kincaids didn't have a firearm. This was confirmed by family, by the contents of their vehicle, by their camping equipment. Doug wasn't a hunter. He carried bear spray, not guns. Someone else had fired a weapon in this location around the time the Kincaids disappeared. Wabakimi Provincial Park has a complicated relationship with its past. During the early 20th century, prospectors, trappers, and hunters built dozens of small cabins throughout the wilderness. When the area became a provincial park in the 1980s, many of these structures were left to decay naturally. They're not maintained, not marked on official maps, but they exist. And occasionally, people use them illegally. Hunters seeking remote access to game, survivalists trying to live off-grid, people running from something. Detective Morin requested all park incident reports from 2018-2019. He was looking for mentions of unusual activity, complaints, sightings of unauthorized persons. One report stood out. August 23, 2019, 2 weeks before the Kincaids' trip, a hiker named Tom Granville had filed a verbal complaint with a park ranger. He'd been canoeing near an unnamed lake in the northern section of the park when he encountered a man with a rifle acting territorial. According to Granville's statement, Guy was maybe 60, long gray beard, wearing camo. He was standing on shore, watching me. When I waved, he didn't wave back, just stared. Then he yelled something like, "This area's closed," or "Keep moving." I didn't stick around to argue. The ranger had noted the complaint, but didn't follow up. No formal report was filed. The park is vast, and people sometimes get possessive about their fishing spots. It wasn't deemed a priority, but now, in hindsight, it looked different. Detective Morin tracked down Tom Granville, now living in Ottawa. The interview was conducted over video call. "I remember him clearly," Granville said. "He made an impression. Not aggressive exactly, but intense. Like he thought he owned the place.
I got the feeling he'd been out there a long time. His clothes were worn out, his beard was wild, and he looked thin, like someone who'd been living rough. Morin asked if Granville could describe the location more precisely. Using maps and GPS, they narrowed it down to an area approximately 20 kilometers from the X location on Doug's map. The satellite phone's call log revealed something crucial. On September 9, 2019, at 3:47 p.m., Doug had attempted to call 911. The call had never connected. The terrain, surrounded by rock ridges and dense forest, had blocked the signal. But the attempt was logged in the phone's memory. Detective Morin studied this detail for a long time. September 9th was likely the day they'd reached the shelter or shortly after. Doug had tried one last time to call for help, and the call had failed. After that, the battery had died completely, and they'd been left with a choice: stay in the shelter or venture back out into the wilderness where something or someone had made them feel unsafe. They'd chosen to stay. Morin met with Trevor and Colleen in Thunder Bay. The conversation was difficult.
4 years of not knowing had finally ended, but the answers brought new pain. "I need to understand your father's mindset," Morin said gently. "If he felt threatened, how would he typically react?" Trevor thought for a long time before answering. "Dad wasn't confrontational, ever. If there was a conflict, he'd de-escalate or remove himself from the situation. He always said, 'You can't win an argument with stupid, so don't try.'" Colleen added, "He was protective of Mom, intensely. If he thought she was in danger, he'd do anything to keep her safe, even if it seemed irrational to someone else." Then Trevor mentioned something he'd never told investigators before. Back in the 80s, when Dad was working in the bush, he witnessed something. He never talked about it much, but I got the story from Mom once. He'd been surveying timber in a remote area and stumbled on 2 guys, poachers, arguing over a kill. It got violent. One of them pulled a knife. Dad hid until they left, then hiked out and reported it. But he said it changed how he saw the wilderness, made him realize that the most dangerous thing in the forest isn't the wildlife. Morin wrote this down carefully. He had trauma related to encountering dangerous people in remote areas. Not trauma, exactly, Trevor said, but awareness. He was always hyper-aware of other people when camping, always noted if he saw signs someone else had been in an area. Mom used to joke that he could spot a cigarette butt from 50 meters away. This context reframed everything. Doug hadn't overreacted. He'd seen something, or someone, that triggered a deeply ingrained fear. And he'd made a choice to protect Vivian the only way he knew how, by running. Detective Morin built a timeline on a whiteboard in the investigation room. September 3 through 6. Kincaids follow planned route, everything normal. September 7. They spot a recently used campsite. Doug becomes uneasy. Vivian's journal entry. September 7, evening/night, they decide to leave their planned route, pack up camp, abandon canoe. September 8, travel 12+ kilometers cross-country. Vivian injures ankle. GPS dies. They mark the shelter as their destination. September 9, arrive at shelter. Doug attempts 911 call, fails. Satellite phone battery dies. September 9 through 15, estimated. Trapped at shelter, consuming remaining food slowly, unable or unwilling to leave. Mid-September, both die from exposure and dehydration. One survivor covers the other's face, then their own. The unanswered question remained. Even with Vivian's injured ankle, even with dead electronics, they could have attempted to walk back. They had Doug's compass, his map, his decades of experience. Unless they believed leaving was more dangerous than staying. Unless they thought someone was watching. September 2023. Detective Morin organized a systematic search of the wilderness surrounding the shelter. The goal? Find evidence of illegal habitation. The team included OPP officers, park rangers, and, critically, trackers from the Lac Seul First Nation, whose traditional territory included parts of Wabakimi. These trackers knew the land in ways that GPS and maps could never capture.
8 kilometers from the shelter, near a hidden inlet accessible only by a narrow game trail, they found it. A long-term wilderness camp, concealed so well that you could walk within 20 meters and never see it. Tarps strung between trees, colored to blend with the forest canopy. A fire pit dug deep and lined with rocks to minimize smoke visibility. A makeshift lean-to built against a rocky outcrop, reinforced with cut branches and moss. The site appeared abandoned, but the evidence of extended habitation was clear. Rusted tools, an axe, a shovel, a saw. Empty food containers with labels dating to 2018 and 2019. Tattered clothing hanging from branches, rotted through but still recognizable. Camouflage patterns, work boots worn down to nothing. And shotgun shells, dozens of them, scattered around the camp. 12-gauge, same type as the one found at the X location. But it was 2 items that turned the discovery from curious to criminal. Hanging from a low branch, faded by sun and rain but still intact, a red bandana. The family confirmed that Doug had been wearing a red bandana in the last photo taken before their trip. It was his habit. He'd worn one for decades to keep sweat out of his eyes. Inside the lean-to, partially buried under rotted canvas, a metal compass. Engraved on the back, D. Kincaid, 1995. Trevor identified it immediately from photos. That was Dad's. My grandfather gave it to him. He took it on every camping trip. He'd never leave it behind willingly. These items had been taken from the Kincaids. Someone had lived in this camp for an extended period. Someone with a firearm, with tools, with the knowledge to survive long-term in the wilderness.
And that someone had taken trophies, or evidence, from Douglas and Vivian Kincaid. Carved into the bark of a large pine tree near the camp, initials CH, and below them 47 tally marks. The marks looked old, weathered, but still visible. 47 days. The tally marks suggested someone tracking time, possibly during the summer of 2019. Every surface that could hold a fingerprint was processed. The compass, a glass bottle found in the lean-to, the handle of the axe. They got hits. Partial prints, degraded by weather and time, but enough for comparison. The prints were run through the National RCMP database. Match, Clayton Horn. Age 58 in 2019, would be 62 now if still alive. His criminal record told a story of escalation. 1987, assault charge, suspended sentence. 1994, weapons possession, fine and probation. 2006, threatening behavior toward a neighbor, charges dropped. 2015, trespassing on Crown land, warning issued. His last known address, Kenora, Ontario, 2016. After that, nothing. No tax filings, no address changes, no contact with government services. He'd effectively disappeared into the wilderness. Detective Moran spent 2 weeks tracking down people who'd known Horn. The picture that emerged was troubling. His former employer, a construction company in Kenora, said, Clayton was good at his job, very capable, but he got paranoid over time, started saying the government was watching him, that chemicals in the water were making people compliant. Eventually, he just stopped showing up. His ex-wife, divorced since 1998, was willing to talk. Clayton changed in the 90s. He became obsessed with self-sufficiency, doomsday stuff. He'd stockpile food, talk about how society was going to collapse, and he'd be the only one ready. I couldn't live with it. After the divorce, he moved further and further from civilization. A former friend. Last time I saw Clay was probably 2015. He was living in a trailer outside town. No electricity, no running water. He'd come into town once a month for supplies, then disappear. He talked about finding a place where he could live how he wanted, where the government couldn't bother him. Said tourists were destroying the wild places. He was angry about it, really angry. Detective Moran assembled his findings into a working theory. Clayton Horn had been living illegally in Wabakimi Provincial Park, possibly for years. He was territorial, armed, and mentally unstable, likely suffering from paranoid delusions about government overreach and societal collapse.
The Kincaids, experienced campers following their planned route, had unknowingly entered his territory. On or around September 7, 2019, they encountered evidence of Horn, his camp or his supplies, or perhaps the man himself. Doug, with his past trauma about dangerous encounters in the wilderness, immediately recognized the threat. He made the decision to avoid confrontation by leaving their canoe and traveling overland. But Horn had seen them. Maybe he'd confronted them directly, or maybe he'd tracked them. Either way, he'd taken items from them, the bandana, the compass, either as trophies or to intimidate them. The Kincaids reached the old shelter and barricaded themselves inside, hoping to wait out the danger. Doug had tried to call 911, but the call failed. His phone died. Vivian's ankle was injured. She couldn't make a difficult overland journey. So they stayed, eating their supplies slowly, hoping rescue would come or that Horn would leave the area. But neither happened. They died believing they were being watched, died afraid to leave the shelter. And Horn? He'd either moved on, never knowing the consequence of his actions, or he'd known exactly what was happening and did nothing. September through November 2023, the OPP launched a formal manhunt for Clayton Horn. His photo, a driver's license picture from 2015 showing a thin man with a long gray beard and hard eyes, was circulated to every park ranger, police department, and conservation officer in northern Ontario. Helicopter sweeps with thermal imaging covered 500 square kilometers of wilderness. Ground teams checked old mines, abandoned cabins, remote fishing camps. They found more evidence of transient camps, cold fire pits, improvised shelters, but nothing definitive. Horn, if he was still alive, had gone to ground. Detective Morin held a press conference in Thunder Bay. "We believe Clayton Horn has critical information about the deaths of Douglas and Vivian Kincaid. If you've seen him, if you have any information about his whereabouts, contact police immediately. Do not approach him." Trevor and Colleen appeared on national news, making an emotional plea. "If you're out there," Trevor said, his voice breaking, "and you know what happened to our parents, please come forward. They didn't deserve to die afraid and alone. They were good people. They deserved better." But the forest doesn't carry television signals, and if Clayton Horn was still in the bush, he wasn't watching the news. Winter came early that year. By December, snow had buried the northern forests under 3 feet of white. Active searches became impossible. Horn's case file remained open, but the likelihood of finding him alive diminished with every passing week. At his age, with winter setting in, survival became increasingly improbable. The theory was widely accepted among investigators. Horn's paranoid territorial behavior had frightened the Kincaids into a fatal decision. Whether through direct confrontation or simply his threatening presence, he was responsible for their deaths. But without a body, without a confession, without witnesses, the case couldn't move forward. Clayton Horn remained a ghost in the machine. A name, a set of fingerprints, a few fading photographs. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of northern Ontario, the truth rested with him. In the months following the discovery, as the forensic reports were finalized and the investigation narrowed on Clayton Horn, certain details continued to haunt everyone involved. The covered faces most of all. Dr. Simone Berengen, a forensic psychologist, was brought in to consult on the case. Her specialty was understanding the final actions of people in extreme circumstances. She studied the photographs of the scene for hours, read every report, examined the fabric analysis. Her conclusion was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "This is an act of intimacy and surrender," she told Detective Morin. "In many cultures across history, covering the face of the deceased is about preserving dignity, protecting the spirit, preparing the body for whatever comes next. But in this case, the evidence suggests the act may have been performed by the dying themselves." Her theory? As Doug and Vivian realized death was inevitable, that rescue wasn't coming, that they couldn't escape, that their bodies were failing, one of them made the decision to cover the other's face. Most likely Doug, she suggested. He would have been physically stronger longer. When Vivian died, perhaps as she slept, perhaps as she sat beside him holding his hand, Doug would have torn strips from their clothing. He would have wrapped her face carefully, lovingly, sparing her the indignity of decomposition, protecting her from whatever came after.
And then, with failing hands and failing light, he would have covered his own face. The act wasn't about hiding from the world, Dr. Bergeron said. It was about not wanting to see the end, about maintaining a sense of control when everything else was beyond control. It was the last loving gesture two people could offer each other. Detective Morin was quiet for a long time after hearing this. Then he asked, "Do you think they knew that they were dying?" "Yes," Dr. Bergeron said simply. "They knew." The unused sedative mixture continued to puzzle investigators. They had prepared it, carefully mixing water, pine needles, and Vivian's anxiety medication into a drink that would have eased their final moments. It would have brought drowsiness, calm, a gentle fading. But they never drank it. Dr. Bergeron offered several possibilities. They may have intended to use it, but in the final moments, fear stopped them. Fear that if they fell asleep, they'd never wake. Or perhaps hope. Hope that even in the last hours, rescue might still come, and they wanted to be conscious for it. Alternatively, one of them may have prepared it for the other, but the other refused. A final act of stubbornness or love, choosing to face death fully conscious, together. Or, Dr. Bergeron added quietly, they simply wanted to remain with each other, aware, until the very end. Not to escape into unconsciousness, but to be present. To not be alone in those final moments. The thermos sat in an evidence locker, still sealed, still full. A choice unmade. Everything about the shelter suggested preparation and acceptance. The neatly arranged belongings, packs positioned carefully, tent rolled and tied, sleeping bags folded. These weren't the actions of people in panic. The positioning of their bodies, seated upright, close together, hands touching. They'd chosen to face death this way, not lying down, not curled in fetal positions of despair, but sitting, together. The wrapped faces, an intimate ritual performed in the darkest moment. But the unused satellite phone and GPS haunted everyone. Why not try one more time to power them on? Why not attempt to walk out, even knowing it was dangerous? The answer, Detective Morin believed, lay in fear. Doug had made a calculation, he said. Stay in the shelter and maybe die, or leave the shelter and definitely encounter whatever, whoever, had frightened them. He chose the maybe. He thought they had a chance if they stayed. He was wrong. Colleen and Trevor struggled to process the details. But in the way families do, they searched for meaning in the horror. "I think Dad tried everything to save Mom," Colleen said in a later interview. "And when he couldn't, when he realized they weren't going to make it, he stayed with her. That's who he was. He wouldn't leave her, not even to save himself." Trevor focused on the wrapped faces. The fact that they cared about that, even at the end, about dignity, about protecting each other, that tells me they were still themselves, still the parents I knew. Fear didn't take that from them. The family requested that certain details not be released publicly. The exact concentration of medication in the thermos, the specific positioning of hands and bodies. Some things, they felt, should remain private. But they authorized Dr. Beaumont and Dr. Bergeron to present the case at forensic conferences, hoping it might help train future investigators to understand the psychology of death in wilderness isolation. Could Clayton Horne have blocked their exit actively? Could he have been watching the shelter, preventing them from leaving? Or was it simply his presence in the general area, his territorial warning, his possession of a firearm that paralyzed them with fear? Did he know they were dying in that shelter? One scenario haunted Detective Morin. Horne, checking his usual routes, seeing the shelter, and knowing someone was inside. Perhaps he'd waited them out, curious to see if they'd leave his territory. Perhaps he'd never known they were in distress. Or perhaps he had known. Perhaps he'd seen their footprints, followed their path, and made a conscious decision to let nature take its course. No evidence pointed one way or the other. The tragedy wasn't just that Doug and Vivian died. It was that they died believing they couldn't be saved, believing that the risk of leaving was greater than the risk of staying.
And in that calculation, made with incomplete information and rising panic, they'd been wrong. 47 kilometers from help. A satellite phone that needed only a bit of battery life. A 911 call that had been attempted but failed to connect. The margin between life and death had been so thin. The remains of Douglas and Vivian Kincaid were cremated in Thunder Bay on October 15, 2023. A memorial service was held at a small church overlooking Lake Superior, attended by over 300 people, former colleagues, fellow campers, park rangers who'd searched for them, friends who'd never stopped hoping. Trevor delivered the eulogy.
He spoke about his parents' love for the wilderness, their quiet partnership, the way they'd taught him and Colleen to respect nature's power and beauty. They loved Wapakimi, he said. It gave them peace for 40 years. It's not the land's fault that one man's darkness crossed their path. The ashes were scattered, with special permission from Ontario Parks, at their favorite campsite in Wabakimi, a spot on the shore of Smoothwater Lake where they'd camped at least a dozen times. Colleen and Trevor paddled out together, released the ashes into the water, and watched them drift toward the tree line. They're home now, Colleen said. In response to the Kincaid case, Ontario Parks implemented several new safety protocols for Wabakimi and other remote wilderness parks. Mandatory check-ins. Campers on trips longer than 3 days must check in with park rangers every 72 hours, either by satellite phone or in person. Satellite phone rental program. Low-cost or free rental of satellite phones with pre-charged batteries and simplified 911 access. Increased patrols. More frequent ranger patrols in remote areas, specifically looking for signs of illegal habitation. Wilderness safety workshops. Free workshops for campers covering emergency protocols, threat assessment, and decision-making in isolation. The Kincaid family supported these measures publicly, though Trevor admitted in a private moment, "No policy will bring them back, but if it saves someone else, then maybe their deaths mean something." The legal limbo. Without Clayton Horn's body, without a confession, without a witness, criminal charges remained hypothetical. If Horn were found alive, he could be charged with theft, the bandana and compass, mischief, possibly criminal negligence causing death. But proving the last charge would be difficult. The defense would argue that Horn had no obligation to help the Kincaids, that he didn't know they were in distress, that his mere presence in the wilderness couldn't constitute a crime. The Crown Attorney's Office prepared hypothetical scenarios, but everyone knew the truth. Justice, if it came at all, would be incomplete. Through the winter of 2023-2024, reports trickled in. A trapper near Pickle Lake claimed to have seen a hermit figure moving through the forest in January 2024. He reported it to local police, but by the time anyone could investigate, another snowstorm had erased any tracks. In February 2024, a conservation officer discovered an abandoned camp near Gull Bay. It had been used recently, within the past month, based on the condition of the fire pit. Shotgun shells were found nearby. They were sent to a lab and matched the type associated with Horn's camp. But by the time an OPP team arrived, the site was empty. Whoever had been there had moved on. Every lead was followed. Every one ended in snow, silence, or dead ends. In March 2024, Trevor and Colleen formally established the Vivian and Douglas Kincaid Wilderness Safety Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing free GPS devices and emergency beacons to low-income families, offering wilderness safety training and mental health resources for people living off-grid or in isolation, raising awareness about the signs of territorial and paranoid behavior in remote communities. The foundation partnered with Ontario Parks, Search and Rescue Ontario, and several Indigenous communities to develop culturally sensitive safety programs. "Mom and Dad would want something good to come from this," Colleen said at the foundation's launch event. "They'd want other families to be safe." Detective Morin gave an interview to CBC's The Fifth Estate in May 2024. "We have not located Clayton Horn," he said. "Given his age, the harsh conditions, and the time that's passed, it's possible he's no longer alive. But until we have evidence of that, we continue to consider him a person of interest." Asked if he thought Horn knew the Kincaids had died, Morin was silent for a long moment. "I think he knew they were there," he finally said.
Whether he knew they were dying or whether he cared, I can't say. But what happened to Doug and Vivian is every wilderness lover's nightmare. Not that nature harmed them, but that human unpredictability found them in a place where they had no recourse. The case file remained open. Photos of Clayton Horne stayed pinned in ranger stations across northern Ontario. Tips were still accepted, investigated, logged. But as spring turned to summer in 2024, and the forest canopy thickened and the tourists returned to Wabakimi's lakes, the active search quietly wound down. The wilderness had swallowed Clayton Horne the same way it had once held Doug and Vivian, completely, silently, with no intention of giving them back. The shelter still stands, though time is erasing it. Park rangers who visited the site report that the roof has collapsed further. The walls, stacked stones held together by nothing but gravity and lichen, are beginning to slump. In another decade, maybe two, it will be indistinguishable from the natural rock formations around it. Ontario Parks has not removed it. The location is too remote, and bureaucratic consensus holds that nature should be allowed to reclaim what was always hers. But those who know the story avoid the place. One ranger admitted, off the record, "I've hiked within half a kilometer of it. Something about the area feels wrong, too quiet, even for the forest. Maybe it's just knowing what happened there, but I don't linger." The wilderness is neutral. It doesn't judge, doesn't hate, doesn't love. It simply is, vast, indifferent, operating by rules older than human consciousness. But humans carry their darkness everywhere, into cities, into homes, into the deepest forests where they think no one is watching. Doug and Vivian made choices based on incomplete information and rising fear. They encountered someone who saw them not as fellow travelers, but as intruders on his land. And in trying to protect each other, they walked into a trap of their own making. The covering of faces, that final intimate act, speaks to their bond. Even in death, they thought of each other. Even when hope was gone, dignity remained. Did Clayton Horne ever know they died? Did he return to the shelter at some point, peer through the low doorway, see their bodies seated together? Or did he simply move on after scaring them away from his territory, never thinking about them again, never wondering if they'd made it out? Is he still out there, living under another name in another park, still territorial, still armed, still convinced the wilderness belongs to him and him alone? Or has the forest finally claimed him the way it claimed Doug and Vivian? Has winter cold, or hunger, or injury reduced him to bones among the pine needles, hidden from the sky by thick canopy, never to be found? In his last recorded interview about the case, Detective Marin sat in his office in Thunder Bay, the investigation files boxed and archived behind him. "The hardest part isn't the mystery," he said. "It's the proximity to salvation. They were 47 kilometers from help. Doug's 911 call, if it had connected, would have brought helicopters within hours. If the satellite phone battery had lasted one more day, if the terrain had been just slightly different to allow a signal, they'd be alive." He paused, looking out the window at the forest beyond the city. The margin between life and death was so thin, a matter of battery life and cell signal, and one man's paranoid fear of intrusion. But fear is a powerful thing. It can make the irrational feel rational. It can turn a shelter into a tomb. And once you're committed to a bad decision in the wilderness, there's often no way back. Trevor and Colleen have returned to camping, though never alone, never in Wabakimi. They carry satellite beacons now, fully charged with one-button 911 access. They file detailed trip plans and check in religiously. They've taught their own children to respect the wilderness, but never to romanticize it. "I camp to honor them," Trevor said, "not to fear what happened. They'd hate for their story to stop others from experiencing the peace they found out there for so many years." But he admits that sometimes, sitting by a campfire as darkness settles over the trees, he thinks about his parents in that shelter, wonders what they talked about in those final days, wonders if they blamed themselves, blamed each other, or simply held on to each other and waited. "I hope they weren't scared at the very end," he said. "I hope it was peaceful." Close your eyes and see it. A small stone shelter, half buried among rocks and trees, 47 kilometers from help. Inside, 2 people seated together against the wall, their bodies held together by time and dry air. Their faces covered, carefully, lovingly, with strips of fabric torn from their own clothing. Their hands positioned as if they'd been holding on to each other as life faded. Between them, a red thermos, sealed, full, a choice unmade, a comfort unneeded. Around them, their belongings arranged neatly, a tent that was never pitched, food that was never eaten, a journal whose last page ended mid-sentence, "If anyone finds this." Outside, the forest continues its ancient rhythm, seasons turning, snow falling, pine needles carpeting the ground. Loons call across the lakes. Northern lights dance green and violet in the autumn sky. The wilderness carries on, indifferent to human tragedy, indifferent to human love.
And somewhere, in a nameless camp beside a hidden creek, or beneath a pile of stones in a forgotten ravine, Clayton Horne's story continues, or ended. The forest knows, but the forest doesn't speak. The wilderness keeps its secrets well. It doesn't judge, doesn't explain. It simply exists, vast and patient, holding everything it's given and giving back only what it chooses. Douglas and Vivian Kincaid went into that wilderness seeking peace. They found it for a while, and then they found something else. Their case remains officially open, but anyone who knows wilderness knows the truth. Some questions don't have answers. Some losses don't have closure. Some doors, once closed, are never reopened. The shelter is collapsing. The forest is reclaiming it. In time, there will be nothing left to mark where 2 people spent their final days, where they held hands and faced the end together, where they performed one last act of love in the face of helplessness. And the only witnesses are the trees, which say nothing at all.